Hello, I've just had one question for Wu-Tang Wednesday today, and the question is, can I do a video on the hierarchy of power in Of Mice and Men? So here goes, my triangle here represents a pyramid of power. Now, if we just think of this as financial power, what does this give us in terms of our pyramid? Well, sitting at the top is the boss. He is able to exploit all the other people on the ranch because he controls their finances at a time of great poverty nationally. You'll be familiar with the Great Depression and the poverty of other people on the ranch. Okay, well, next in line, because he's male and also the boss's son, is Curly. He's going to inherit the power on this ranch, and therefore he appears next in the pyramid. Well, who is next most financially secure? This is a more difficult question, but probably it would have to be Curly's wife. So she has a higher status on the ranch because of that. However, that status is challenged because she's a woman. So her position is under threat because she's a woman. Now, allied to her are Susie and Clara, and these are the brothel keepers. So they're madams, they're living off the income of their prostitutes. They have more financial clout than Curly's wife, but they would be treated by society, society at large that is, lower down the social pyramid, whereas Curly's wife would be raised because she's married. However, in the world of the novel, Curly's wife is judged by the men. This is an entirely male society, and she is seen as a tart. They don't trust her. Susie and Clara would also sell themselves for sex. No doubt they don't have to anymore because other people do that, younger prostitutes. However, the men trust Susie and Clara more precisely because they charge money, whereas Curly's wife they don't trust because she's not actually charging them for sex. In fact, she's not after sex at all. She's never asked any of the men for sex on the ranch, and yet they still dismiss her. And so they take her social standing and reduce it. So she becomes lower than these ex-prostitutes, Susie and Clara. Next on the ranch, we have Slim. He is the most secure because he's described as godlike. Everybody looks up to him. He's financially secure because he's a permanent resident of the ranch. He seems to be incredibly good at his job, and the boss won't want to get rid of him. Well, interestingly, we next have Crooks. He is the next permanent member on the ranch, and therefore the next most secure. He's more secure than Candy because Candy knows he's going to get canned, he's going to get sacked because he's only got one hand, and therefore he's going to be useless soon. He's going to be too old, and all he can do is clean the bunkhouse, and soon he won't be efficient at that. So Crooks is actually more useful and therefore ahead of Candy. However, just as Curly's wife should be higher in status than Susie and Clara, but isn't because of the discrimination from the men, so Crooks is discriminated against because he's black, and he falls lower in the pecking order, in the hierarchy. So on this side, I'm keeping the people who are victims of the society they're in. Right. Next, we have Carlson. He perhaps is inferior to Candy because Candy at least has a job for longer than Carlson, and he also has more savings. He's had a payoff. So Carlson is socially inferior to Candy, although he's able-bodied. However, if we move Candy across here, he falls below Carlson because Carlson is able to persuade Slim that Slim should allow him to kill Candy's dog. This reduces Candy's status. He doesn't get to defend not just his own property, because I don't think Candy sees the dog as his property. It's much more close relationship than that. It's like a friend. Okay, then we have the introduction of Lenny and George. Lenny is clearly superior. George is clearly superior to Lenny. And when he arrives on the ranch, he's inferior to Carlson and superior to Lenny. Crooks, however, is inferior to both of them, and so he drops to the bottom of the pile. But let's look at the story in a little bit more detail. Carlson ends the story with Curly when he says, "Now what the hell do you suppose is eating them two guys?" So he feels superior to Slim and to George. And Steinbeck is possibly making the point that these kind of heartless, violent men, like Carlson, become superior in this impoverished society because violence works. Curly is determined to kill Lenny and will get away with it. There's no question that this will be something that the law will prosecute him for. He'll simply get away with it. That's why he's quite happy to send for the deputy sheriff, because he knows that there will be no interference from the law when they kill Lenny. And Carlson's view is much like Curly's, and this is the prevailing world view that Steinbeck's attacking. He's attacking that kind of masculinity, but at the same time showing that Carlson is superior in terms of power within the society. He's much more likely to keep his job than Candy is long term, and possibly than George is. George, you'll remember, is linked to Lenny, who's crushed Curly's hand, and they're much more likely to get sacked. However, Steinbeck offers George the opportunity to escape this. So George, if he comes over here with Candy, will have the money to start the ranch. Now, we've seen the dream ranch involves Lenny, but once George kills Lenny, he only loses the potential of $50. George can still work to raise that extra money. That's only an extra month's work. Candy's got $350. They could still set up the ranch. And they could invite crooks. So one of the tragedies of the novel is that these three could start an alternative society, one in which two white characters welcome a black character, in which the more youthful George welcomes the disabled and old Candy, and the discriminated against crooks. In other words, they have the opportunity to open up a kind of utopian society, one that will triumph over simple financial power, because they will just have enough money to be self-sufficient, but they will create a better world. However, George prevents this happening. Candy could make it happen, but only with George's help. We could argue that Crooks also prevents it happening because of the actions of Curly's wife, but if we look a little bit more deeply, when George arrives and tells Lenny to leave Crooks's bunkhouse, or his part of the barn, George also conveys society's wider racism to Crooks, and Crooks realises not just that society could turn against him with the threat of lynching, but that actually even people who are reasonable, characters who we like as readers, even they are intrinsically racist. However, another way of looking at the hierarchy is looking at their sympathetic power, how we sympathise with the characters. So we probably sympathise most with Lenny, who seems to have fate loaded against him. He is the one character who is destined not only to be treated badly by others, but cannot escape treating others badly because he simply doesn't understand his own strength or the consequences of his actions. Next, we probably sympathise most with George because he's the one who has to make the most difficult moral decision to kill his friend Lenny in order to protect him from being killed in a more painful way. However, you might argue that we sympathise with Crooks more than we do with George, because like Lenny, he can't escape his fate. No matter how good a person he might become, he cannot escape the fate of being black in a racist society. George can escape, remember. He's got the Dream Ranch on offer with with Candy's money, but he rejects it. So arguably, we sympathise more with Crooks. Now, again, you could argue that we sympathise more with Curly's wife than George because she sacrifices her own life in order to marry Curly, even though she doesn't love him, but it's her only way to escape poverty, and it's her only way to escape the fate of becoming the kind of woman who works as a prostitute with Susie and Clara. So we might sympathise with her more. However, her racism is so extreme in that she genuinely seems to be willing to accuse Crooks of something like rape in order to get him hung, that we can't fully sympathise with her. However, rather than have her plummeting down our sympathy level, Steinbeck wants to point out that much of this is not her fault, and that's why he gets Lenny to kill her. Her death isn't in any way justified, and she's a victim of incredible sexism from George and from Candy, and in many ways from her husband. So the next question is, in the hierarchy of sympathy, do we sympathise more with Candy than Curly's wife? Well, he's less cruel than Curly's wife. However, she suffers a worse fate. She gets killed off in the prime of youth, definitely under 20, probably about 17. Candy is much older, probably late 60s or maybe even his 70s, and yet he's still in employment and has had, by any stretch of the imagination, a long life in terms of this society. So I think probably we sympathise with Candy less. Carlson we have no sympathy for at all. He kills Candy's dog, and he doesn't understand why George would feel so bad about killing Lenny. So our sympathies with him are fairly low down. He also carries this Luger, an emblem of the Nazi Party, and so Steinbeck invites us to be really critical of him. But is he lower than Curly? Well, Curly is the person who tells everybody about keeping his hands soft with Vaseline in order to pleasure his wife, and that lowers her status considerably. Curly is also the person who wants to kill Lenny out of revenge, and is therefore responsible for George doing it. So I think, although Carlson kills Candy's dog, we can definitely see Curly as a more vicious and worse person, and so he comes lower down the pecking order, lowest in our hierarchy of sympathy. However, if we come over to the other part, this is much more difficult. On this side of the pyramid, what do we feel about the boss? He seems quite cruel. He gives them whiskey at Christmas, so that's seen as really generous by the men, but not by us, the readers. And he forces Crooks to engage in a fight, introducing rules that means there's no kicking, but that doesn't really help Crooks. He's simply forced to fight for the entertainment of others. This is very cruel. Slim is at the top of our pyramid. Here he's described as godlike. Everybody else looks up to him, and we might sympathise entirely with Slim. However, he's very ruthless. He allows Candy's dog to be killed. He drowns as many puppies as he thinks necessary. And it's not so much the killing of the puppies, it's just how remarkably practical he is. Killing them off causes him no moments of guilt whatsoever. And he also tells George that you had to kill Lenny. He justifies the killing of Lenny, again, without any question of this being a difficult decision for him, although he does appreciate what a difficult decision this would be for George. He is the most understanding character on the ranch. He seems to understand all the other characters and he sympathises with them. He's the only person to treat Crooks as not an equal, but as a human being. He never seems to call him nigger or stable-buck. He calls Crooks Crooks. He treats Crooks as a human being, a person. So, arguably, we can put him much higher up in the hierarchy. And he's also the only person who doesn't seem to see Curly's wife as a tart. He just says hi, good looking, to her. He takes her at face value. So he, if you like, is our role model in the book, which is quite interesting, isn't it? He's very practical and ruthless, but Steinbeck might be saying he's the ideal version of what a man should be. Then we have Susie and Clara, who are living off immoral earnings from prostitution and have probably been prostitutes themselves. However, we can see that society has forced them into this, and so they get higher up on our hierarchy of sympathy, probably more so than the boss. The boss is seen to be exploiting the men in a way that Susie and Clara aren't. Wit speaks very highly of Susie in particular and suggests that she's not exploiting her prostitutes, she's keeping them healthy, and is not exploiting the men because she doesn't force them to pay for sex. They can just come and pay for alcohol instead. So that's a new and interesting hierarchy that allows you to consider the novel from a different perspective, not just the financial one. So I hope that helps, and enjoy your revision.